Great, thank you everyone for coming today. I wanted to start today's conversation by asking Susanna about your practice more generally before we start talking about this particular work, because I feel that this kind of builds on something you've been doing for quite a while, but also with a bit of a twist and a change to that. So could you tell us a bit more about what your overarching practice deals with?
Sure. My background is in printmaking, which, as many of you will know, is kind of usually quite small scale because you need a press to make the work usually, or a silk screen, and usually they are kind of so big. And they work in multiples. So I guess that two things, making many of the same thing and working at a relatively small scale, is where I came from. And then I made things like this. So I guess in that sense, having taught printmaking for so many years, I guess when there's any kind of rule, I've always looked at how to sort of bend that or push it or change it. So probably over the last 10 years or so, my works have been not small and not multiples. So that's kind of from the process side of things. In terms of the kind of where the works emerge from in terms of the ideas, I've worked mostly over the last probably 10 years or so on ideas of mapping and mobility. So the way in which we come to kind of know our place in the world by moving through it. So various forms of mapping processes, whether it be tracking on satellites or tracking on webcams or tracking on various sorts of GPS devices that we might have on our phone, and thinking about the ways in which we move. So whether that be by foot, on a bicycle, whatever. But most specifically, I was looking at leisure travel, which was obviously quite prevalent until early 2020 when leisure travel became less prevalent. So I guess that idea of movement, mobility, immobility, but also really kind of trying to eke out and tease out what printmaking can do for me has been my background.
What was the point, just to go back to the to that shift, what was the point at which you decided to depart from the usual premises of printmaking to go into the rubbing?
There's something, the first rubbing I ever did was on a caravan. So I guess I went into it large scale. Like I didn't just do a rubbing of a gravestone, which is where most people start with rubbings. Because I really wanted that sense of, a rubbing is a very interesting process. Well, it's not that interesting, but you can make it interesting in that it relies on you being in absolute proximity to the object that you're rubbing. And I guess for me, a photograph of a caravan or a photograph of the Eiffel Tower or a photograph of a wind turbine does one thing. But by actually being in physical proximity to it and having to rely on its touch with my touch was really what got me into it as a process. It was actually a sense of, it's not a picture of a thing, it is the thing. It's as close as I could get to the thing, whether that be a caravan or an airplane or a boat or whatever it is that I've done rubbings on. It was about that, it was the kind of indexicality that I think you spoke about here at the gallery a few weeks ago. It's not a picture of it or an image of the thing, it is the thing. It's a true reference to the thing. Yeah, so that's where I sort of leapt into the reason for working with frottage as a process.
So thinking about this work, so this is one-to-one wind turbine blade. This is part of this particular exhibition project. We actually started, you and I, talking about this really very much from the beginning of your process, which is where some of the interview material from the video is actually from. But can you just tell me a little bit about what ideas you were originally kind of working with? And then, the thing I find fascinating as a theorist and someone who doesn't have an artistic practice, what the process was of turning that concept into then this work, because the two things are, quite poles apart. Work through it.
So Kit and I started talking about this exhibition when it was first kind of conceived in midway through last year.
Yeah,
it was the end of last year. And I guess I had a fleeting thought about doing some rubbings, but the premise was about energy futures, and I haven't really made work about energy futures in the past. I mean, I guess just to backtrack a little bit, one of the last big rubbings I did was of various aeroplanes, stationary aeroplanes, some in a boneyard in Arizona, and then more recently one in Utah, which was a plane that had been stationary for sort of 50 odd years. And so I kind of like that idea of stillness, of things being still, and this was pre-COVID, so the idea of a commercial jet being stationary was quite unheard of. They weren't still. So I chose that as a process to try and capture this object that is always moving. So I guess that relationship to my desire to capture stillness then translated into when we started talking about our first ideas about these energy transitions and what it is that we can harness in order to try and create cleaner energy modes. I guess I went straight to the place that many people go to, which is wind, wave, all those things that happen around us in a very ongoing way. And I thought, isn't it interesting that I've actually always been interested in mobility, and here we are now talking about wind power, or particularly wave power too. And so I had a fleeting thought that wouldn't it be funny to try and do a rubbing of a wind turbine? It was kind of a fleeting thought because they're big things, and sure, I've rubbed an airplane before, which was sort of about 12 metres, the wing I did of one of these airplanes. And then I did a cruise ship transit, they're called like gangway, so the thing that you walk on. And that was about 15 metres, and I remember thinking, never, ever again am I going to do a rubbing that big, and it's just too hard. And so I think the first thing I sort of said to you, wouldn't it be funny if, haha, and then I put that away thinking, no way would I do that. And then I thought, oh, hang on. So I guess that idea of really making an obvious counterpoint to that which is always moving, which are these turbine blades, seemed to be an interesting idea. So I guess from there I just started to toy with it.
It's interesting because I think when we were first talking about this, you were talking about, for instance, the wind turbine rod nest, and I think at the time I was imagining you up a very big ladder with this thing stuck, and you rubbing rubbing the paper against this. Where did you come about with the actual location of New Geraldton's place called Walkaways? Yeah.
So I had originally thought, wouldn't it be great to just somehow climb up a wind turbine illegally and just do it? And of course, that's just another one of those silly ideas that you have.
Yeah.
So, like with the aircraft, it was just a matter of doing a lot of research on all of the wind turbines that I could think of, sites around. I started with WA, and then I was thinking, I'll go anywhere I can to find one. And I actually did start with Rottnest, thinking that it's relatively small, in fact it's tiny in the scheme of things, and it's very close. And I kind of got various sorts of maybes from them. And in the meantime, I just simply emailed, like I did with the Arizona work, various companies, and I got zero response, which is the way mostly it goes. And I got two. That's kind of interesting, but no. And then I got one yes, which was from this gentleman who's in the audience called Greg. Thank you, Greg. Who said, yeah, sure. What do you want? And I went, oh my goodness, I have never got such a kind of interested and positive response before. Again, with the aircraft boneyards, I got lots of no's, or no responses, and I just got this one singular yes. So sometimes that's all you need. And again, and Greg could probably attest to this later, but you're kind of speaking a slightly different language. I'm saying, hi, I'm an artist and I'd like to rub one of your wind turbines. It's kind of like, what? So there's a bit of sort of trying to work out how those two different languages can kind of meet. So it was just lots of toing and froing, And of course, my question was not, can I get a ladder and climb up your wind turbine? It was, do you happen to have any spare blades lying on the ground? Because I knew that was pure folly, that idea of, because I kind of wanted the idea that maybe someone thought that I could have climbed up there and done it. But I mean, the hub of this is 84 meters off the ground, so it's pretty high. And so Greg got back to me and said, actually, we do have some spare blades, and sent through some photos of these things that were completely foreign to me in terms of scale. Like just the photos of one of Greg standing next door to one, I think, and it was just like, that is huge. That is just the most obscenely massive thing. And I guess you can sort of get a sense of it from this, some of the videos here. But yeah, once I got that initial yes, it was just a matter then of going through the process of, and I mean, I don't want to bore people with risk assessments and things like that, but there was a lot of paperwork that was needed to be done and research agreements, and because you're working with an industry partner, it's not like anyone can just walk in there and start tinkering around with the stuff. So it's a really, and it's a great thing, and I guess we've got a couple of art students here too. It's such a good thing to learn is that you can ask, you can sometimes get a yes if you're lucky. And from that, then it's a matter of actually just switching into a completely different world. You're working with industry partners. There are people who have got serious jobs to do with serious, in this case, faults of electricity zinging around. You've got to, you have to continue with the idea that you had in the most rigorous and kind of authentic way possible, whilst being very conscious of and working with all of those rules, regulations, agreements, blah blahs in between. So it's enjoyable.
I think that's a really important part of it actually as well, is that there's, you have these ideas that the parameters are as wide as your imagination. And then when you actually start working with the reality of, the physicality of the space, but also the other kind of bureaucratic and other sort of constraints that are naturally there, that then alters the process and then alters the outcome. So what was the kind of the slips that happened between that initial kind of conception and then when you actually executed it? Because, I mean, just going back to when you went to the airplane boneyard in Kingman, I think it was, in America, there are certain just physical, environmental kind of restraints such as heat and, having, not only having access to the wing in that case, but actually working with that as a material and how that responds to the environment and how you respond as well as an artist. Because, I mean, I've seen photographs of you in Kingman, but also similarly in the video, wearing the high vis and, at the end of the day, you're kind of covered in this sort of sooty sort of material that comes off the paper. So in that process, what shifts?
Yeah, it's part of the thing that terrifies me about making work in the field, but also that I love and take head on. It's part of, I think it's one of the reasons that I make work in the field, so to speak, like out on site, is because it is mostly unpredictable. You have to think on your feet, move, adjust things as you go. But it also, in some way, I hope, is imbued in the work, that there's some sense of that atmospheric kind of dimension to it. So with the work in Kingman, as you mentioned, heat was one of the things that was really, really had a huge impact on the work, in that lying these sheets of paper on the wing, the heat from the Arizona sun made the gesso really tacky, so it actually did impact the way I could rub it. And of course, the other major factor with doing anything on these sheets of lovingly gessoed paper is, of course, wind. And so again, that sort of challenge of going to a windy place, because that's where wind turbines usually live, with all these sheets of beautifully gessoed paper that are expensive and have had labour and time and hours and hours of layering. We'll talk about that a bit later. But so part of it was confronting that atmospheric quality of this particular site head on. And knowing that it was going to be windy, because that's what it should be. And interestingly, with this particular work, I don't think it affected, the actual wind didn't affect it as much as I thought it would, because it was quite a hot week that week we went up there, and in order to avoid the problems of sweat and sunscreen and all the rest, that heat does to this paper. We had to work quite early in the morning, and it just so happened that that week we were there, it was relative. In fact, some of the video work, you can see that turbine in the background is going pretty slowly. That's not going at its normal 14.4 revolutions per minute. And so this is, I think, still an easterly. You can see it's still facing east. So, and actually that's a relatively blustery patch right there. You can see it's whipping it around a bit, but it wasn't nearly as horrendous as I thought. I mean, I thought I'd come back with sheets that were really torn, bruised. So that was less of an impact. The thing that was probably the biggest shift I had to make on site this time was that we'd done all of the, when I say we, I'm not particularly good at maths, and this is actually a very technical mathematical work in that you needed to, because we didn't take all the sheets up to the site, just the ones that had the rubbing on them, and so to actually get the angles pre-planned correctly to do that sweep through the gallery like it's doing meant a bit of planning beforehand. And when we got to site, the plan that we'd done was obviously a flat drawing of a blade, but when you take it out to site, the blade obviously has all these amazing kind of curves and physicalities to it that then had to be accounted for. So it was more just a shift when we were on site to remeasure and re-plan and re-plot a bit of it.
In fact, there's the diagrams.
Yeah, these are all different angles and things to try and work it out. So, and there was a bit of, then, you know, you come back to the room and you're physically exhausted and covered in black stuff, and then lay it out on the hotel floor, which was about the size of, you know, a suitcase, and trying to see what 4 sheets of paper buttered together look like on the floor. You're having to kind of constantly adapt on the way, and so we actually planned it without the top row on. It was just going to be 6 high. And I think on site I went, hang on a second, it's not going to do what I want into the gallery, so I suddenly had to do the second layer, which meant going back. And so there's a bit of sort of toing and froing.
So you do the preparation in this very kind of you know, very accurate kind of way, but then on site you pretty much kind of got to
wing it.
Yeah.
Well, it's wing it, and I mean again, let's see, that's a very windless morning. On site you have to wing it a bit, and also just kind of have a steely resolve to you that it's going to be okay, because you know, by this time I'd invested a truckload of time and money into getting the paper organised, and you have to fit in busy lives and, you know, other people's time frames. You have to kind of just take a punt that it's going to work, and you know, you've got up there, you've got 4 days, you've just got to do it, and work with those issues and those problems.
So after you've got back and you've got that stack that you have then rubbed, were there adjustments that you had to make to this? I mean, I know it's this is kind of like peeking behind the curtain in a way, because it looks as, you know, very coherent work when you see it now installed. But I'm just wondering if there is a certain amount of tweaking then that you have to do with what you have to make it work, or to make it do something different.
I mean, the hard thing with making big work is you can't see it until it's on the wall. So I hadn't actually seen this work. I put it out in one of the galleries down in the art school. But again, that's a 10 metre, I think, space, and this is 17 metres. So I could only ever see small sections of it. So it's kind of terrifying to make a work that you haven't seen before it's exhibited. So to answer your question, there was a few adjustments that I made. I had originally planned to have a gradation in the sheets so that it actually looked like it was getting, you know, it was going to be this bottom right-hand corner. It was going to be sort of cloud-like, and I'd done a whole lot of tests in my studio where I rub it, and it actually looked like these beautiful kind of voluminous clouds, because I wanted it to look as if it was an atmosphere in itself, and it just became too kind of pictorial, I guess. Okay. So I didn't do that. No, otherwise you just got to take a punt. I mean, the biggest shift for me is the paper itself. It's this handmade Japanese washi paper, which is exquisitely beautiful and very irregular in terms of its size. And when you're dealing with something that's 17 metres long, even a couple of mils difference, when you put that over a number of sheets, it it dawned on both me and the team of installers that we were going to have an incredible amount of difference with the actual size. So you can see in a couple of bits we've had to put in little fillers almost, because that ever so slight shift, which you don't know when you're working on 10 sheets, is a problem. Suddenly when you're working on 103 or whatever it is sheets, it becomes a huge problem. So it was more having to make some adjustments during the install time, and so that week with install I was up and down quite a lot, just doing some sort of fine-tuning. And the other thing too is, of course, with this gallery where there's the atmosphere coming in and out, as in cold days, hot days, dry days, wet days, the paper itself has got a life to it, and on damp days like today it buckles and curls, and on hot, dry days it's very, very flat. So in a way, the actual environment that I hoped I was going to keep out of the gallery is in the gallery too. So in a way, I've learned to be okay with that.
When you so with the Canadian jet wing work that you installed at Fremont Art Centre, Span, I think it was in 2017. That was fixed down, wasn't it?
Yes, that was. But that was. So I've shown that wing work twice. Once as part of the festival, Perth Festival, and it was actually installed horizontally, so there was not so much of a bulge or a pop with that. And then I showed it again in America, and it was on a wall that time, and that was in a completely humid, controlled gallery, so it stayed flat.
Yeah. No, I just think it's kind of interesting, because I remember on the day you were installing this, I think we had a supervision meeting with the student, and you came in and you were quite sort of it's starting to cool. But now I kind of think about it, I think, well, that's really interesting that, you're even getting the impact of the environment, within this relatively controlled
I have to
space.
get better with that. I have to get better with letting control go once it's in the gallery. Because I'm okay with it on the site, but I was a bit worried about it curling and doing strange things. But I'm getting better with being okay with that.
There's other things I remember when we were, because we did several interviews during the period when we were doing this, and you mentioned the paper, this Japanese paper. Was that the paper that you were telling me that you had ordered, and then it took a long, long time? Because the reason why I bring this up is I kind of find this fascinating, because, to me, part of the kind of the organizational part of this work is actually one of the interesting dimensions of the work, that the work lies at the nexus of a whole range of things, from your initial ideas to the materials and other things that are happening in the world. And one of the fascinating things for me, I'm such a dag, one of the fascinating things I found was with the paper was that there were questions as to whether it was going to turn up on time, wasn't there?
COVID, supply chain issues, global movement, all those fun things to talk about. So it was stuck on a boat somewhere, which is ironic given that I'm interested in global mobility. And so I had to change to this Japanese paper which I could get access to, and it's a beautiful paper, it does the same job, but it wasn't the paper that I've worked with before. So it was a bit of to work on new paper and work with size, where I didn't quite know what because paper when it's wet can expand, up to a huge percentage. I don't know what it is technically, but it can be massively different. And this one has just got a bit more of a puff to it than I'd expected. So the other paper doesn't.
I was also interested in how this is a process, because I know that every major work that you make, there's something you take away from that. With this particular process, because this is quite different from all of the other things, what do you think you've taken away from making this one? You've already mentioned, I suppose, the letting go when it's in the gallery space.
I think one of the things, and I mentioned it briefly in one of our interviews, that one of the things I've never done is, with these big, large-scale rubbings, is to do multiple of them, because generally you do one aeroplane wing and that's enough. You sweat it and you're out. Whereas with this, it's actually the same blade 3 or 5 times. So in a way, I like the idea that I was playing with the multiplicity that's inherent in printmaking in a work that is a rubbing, because I really wanted to tap into that idea of this relentless, ongoing ability to, in this case, generate electricity. And so the idea of actually getting that same blade and doing it 5 times as if it is just on this constant sweep was my way, I guess, of not only riffing off printmaking itself, but this idea of the constantness of it. And so with this work, I enjoyed the challenge of doing that same thing 5 times, whereas normally I'd do it once and I'm out. And initially, the first idea that we talked about for this work was to do, because they're 40 metres long, each of these blades, was to just do one tip and just do as long as I could fit on this wall, which is 17 or so metres. And so I thought, it's just going to be one singular blade. And then I thought, hang on, that doesn't really, to me, that's kind of too still. It's almost like a singular, and I wanted a sense of it moving. So yeah, I think doing the same thing 5 times was really good, and I like that. And in fact, I actually did the little circle on it. Is the lightning receptor. So if it gets struck by lightning, it actually channels it. And I just, at the very last day as I was leaving site, I just got some small piece of paper and just did that same lightning receptor, just a set of 6 of them, I think. And I thought, wow, it's the first time I've actually done multiple versions of the same thing. And so I think I've learned something about that. I don't know quite what it is yet, but that it doesn't have to be a singular. Yeah, and I guess just returning back to the kind of the premise for this exhibition, it was kind of there was a lot of thinking time and talking time about how do you in any way try and capture this sense of energy transitions. And it was thinking about those things that just happen every day. The sun comes up, the wind comes in, the waves keep moving. And it was really trying to tap into that, the metronome, the kind of the cycles. And I've done quite a lot of work in the past about days, times, mirroring of different parts of the world and the way the sun comes up in Bermuda and setting in Rottnest Island. There's kind of those circular continuum things. That it seemed kind of a nice link to put it back to being a repetitive thing. And I guess too, like I was at Dirk Harbour this last week, and just watching the incredible, relentless energy of the ocean, because they've got some amazing blowholes there that kind of do this incredible sort of heaving, breathing almost. And I just think, wow, why are we not doing more of this? As in terms of energy production. And the other thing too about wind turbines is, apart from the one at Rottnest, they generally come in pairs, multiples. Like, you drive in this particular ridge and walk away, you look along and there's, there are 52 at this particular wind farm, but that abuts another one. So I guess that sense of this is a multiple thing and we need to have more of them. Seemed to be, I like that idea of it being more than one.
And I think that, I've only ever gotten close to one on occasion. And, like you said as well, the scale of them is so enormous. And, I think that one of the interesting things about looking at this work is that, if you look on the video, you get a sense of how much of that blade is actually portrayed in that longest image, and it's not very much. So there's it's not a really clear sense, but it's more of a really strong suggestion of the colossal size of this machinery.
And I think too, it's a bit like standing on the wing of an airplane. It's not something we're always separated from a wing, or generally. We are always separated from a wind turbine. It's not something that we just have in the footy oval. So they are kind of a little bit, there's something about being in close proximity to something that allows you to have a greater understanding of it. So again, that comes back to the rubbing thing, the fact that I had to be in proximity to this. But also, I think with the titles, where I always put 1 to 1 at the beginning of these frottages, because I really want to bring in that sense of, I guess, a human scale. It's not a 1 to 500,000 map. It is a 1 to 1 human scale of us in a gallery in relation to this, me as the artist in relation to this object. So yeah, I like the idea of, 1 to 1 speaks of architectural plans, it speaks of mapping things, it brings the human absolutely into the fore. A ratio on a map means nothing to an ant. It only means something to us as humans. So I guess I thought that having that as part of the title is super important.
I think I might ask if anyone, because I'm conscious of time, we've got about another 20 minutes, if anyone has any questions for Susanna? Or for me? Why you'd ask me, I don't know. But Mark?
I'll have to top you on the dagginess stakes, because I always ask too many questions. But thanks so much, Kit and Susanna, for your talk. And great for some sort of industry partners showing interest in the work. It's great. When I look at the work and listen to the conversation, I find the sootiness, the smoky, the blackness of the gesso dominates the work. I'm interested, Susanna, how that plays into your reading of the work. Is it a paradox? Does it background the work? Is it a complement, or how do you understand how that carbon sootiness?
Yeah. It's one of the things that I will use the word worried me about the work, because in order to get the frottage to work, you need to have a high contrast. So you need to have a dark background. And a lot of the works I've done before have been on pure black, and they've often looked quite X-ray and quite forlorn. Like they often look apocalyptic. I mean, they often look kind of a bit grim, to be honest. And so I knew that with this work, because it was going to be black and white, it was going to be sooty and dark and a bit grim. And for an exhibition that was supposed to be about energy transitions and energy futures, I was thinking, is this going to be too gloomy? And the first iteration I did of it was in a blue, like a kind of a sky blue, like that really, not purple blue, but a real blue, which is a god-awful colour. And I did some tests with it. I've got, in fact, I don't know if they're on the video, I've got piles and piles of tests at home, because I was really conscious that I wanted to play in with the theme of the show, which was, happy, shiny energy futures. And I did lots of tests, and they were fine, but I just couldn't go there. It's a colour frightens me at the best of times, but it was a particularly awful blue. And the frottage worked quite nicely. So I was there, and all the original plans I sent up to the gallery were blue. And then I just thought, no, I have to stay true to what it is that because I don't find it all optimistic and Pollyanna-ish. I think it is somewhat gloomy, the fact that we don't have more of this. So it was a worry for me that I was going to go to this dark. And that was why this side was going to be these kind of optimistic clouds. I didn't want it to look too gloomy. And so this actually is a Prussian blue, which is quite a stunning blue, but it looks a lot blacker here in the space than I was anticipating. Again, if you use a really flat black, it's kind of a dead black. This has got a bit more depth to it. So yeah, it's certainly not all shiny, happy, smiling faces, energy futures. And maybe there's potential for it to, I don't know, it's something I was conscious of. And in fact, in the artist statement in the catalogue, I wrote a paragraph about how kind of sooty and dark and gloomy it looks. And then I thought, hang on, that's stating the bloody obvious, really. Yeah, it's a compromise with getting the image to do its thing, but also I quite like that paradox to it as well.
Yeah, I remember when we were doing the interviews, part of the process, and you use the word worried, and you were quite concerned. But how can I produce this thing that's making energy that's quite sooty? So I know that it was a really big consideration.
Yeah.
And it's quite funny, isn't it? It's just simply a colour choice. But,
it does. And the blues were really quite nice. I just couldn't do it. Couldn't go there.
Do you think it was, I know that with this work in particular, there's a constant tension between wanting it to portray the thing that it's portraying, which is the wind turbine light, but also to avoid a kind of a pictoriality which, wanders into kitsch. And to use a kind of a sky blue, gradients of blue.
Would go there.
And it goes there, yeah.
And the other thing I was worried about this was it was going to look still, and ultimately I wanted it to look like it had motion. And so I did some tests with the kind of cartoonesque whoosh after each of the blades.
Yeah.
So I sort of rubbed this sort of that because it goes clockwise.
Yeah.
So the sort of the back end of it, the right-hand side of each of the blades, where I sort of rubbed a bit of lightness there, so it sort of looked like a whoosh, and it was just so kitschy. It was like a bad graphic design thing. It didn't work. So I guess I had hoped, and I think it worked to an extent, that just the angles of them indicates this sense of movement. Because the thing that I still really like about this work, just talked about, that worry me and I find them problematic, the thing I really like about it is that it is actually what this blade is doing all day, every day. It's exactly, if we were put up on a cherry picker and stood in front of it, this is exactly the angle that would come past our heads at. And I kind of like that, the fact that it is what it is. It is what it, and that's the reach of it. I mean, it keeps on going that way and it keeps on going that way. They're huge, and this is a small one. I mean, some of the blades on some of the biggest ones are twice as long, I think. They're ridiculously huge. This is a mini one. It's good.
I guess I've got a little bit of a comment, if I may. You mentioned before about the controlled environment versus uncontrolled, and I just wanted to say I really have enjoyed seeing the sort of weathering that's taken place here in the gallery with the curling of the sheets that you weren't expecting. And to me, it sort of is quite an interesting state of play between what happens outside and what happens in a place that you expect. You know, you have complete control over. And
I think every single piece of work that anyone ever makes, you learn something from. And that's one of the most exciting things that I'll take away from this, is to actually work with that much more so. Because as I said before, I'm okay with it in the field. I enjoy it. I like it. I love the bruised paper. I like the tears or the rips or the punctures or the sunscreen or the sweat. You know, that to me is part of the work. But I hadn't got my head wrapped around its life that it could have in a gallery space. So I think that, and you know, quite often I'll hang these where the bottom's not pinned, so it's just hinged from the top. But this time I didn't want to do that because I was conscious of the airflow, because I knew that the doors were going to open and shut and the airflow. And in a way, the fact that I'd made the call to pin the bottoms has actually amplified the fact that it's expanding and contracting with the atmosphere. So I think it's a really exciting thing to work with more. And I know which paper to use now.
Do you think this will go on to be exhibited somewhere else? I suppose it's hard to say.
Big enough wall. Yes, it's all wall dependent really, and I would never show it in it's not. I was talking to someone, one of the senior executive team here at the opening, and they said, "Oh, you know, you can sell little tips of it," and I was like, "No, I can't. That's not what. This has to stay together as a piece of work." But it's finding a gallery with big enough walls, and I made this for this wall, knowing that this was the space that I had. I made the work as big as the wall because that was what I could.
Is this the biggest work you've made?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, by far, and it was ridiculously hard work. And I've got lovely Sharon in the background there, who was my assistant on some of it, and she can attest to the fact that it is each of these sheets of paper has got one layer and then sanded, and then another layer and then sanded, then the third layer and sanded, and then the fourth layer, and then you do the rubbing. So it's actually got 4 layers of gesso on each sheet of paper, even the blank ones, because if you don't.
So the blank ones are no less work than
time
the ones
intensive. They just haven't taken a trip to Georgia and back. Some of them did, but not all of them. It was just blood, sweat, and tears doing that. And I mean, the amount we use a foam brush that's kind of this big. The amount of pots of gesso and foam brushes I went through, speaking of environmental considerations, not good. And that was the other thing. So I just want to quickly mention before we run out of time. The first, because I went up to site to do a recce to check that everything was going to be okay, and that the actual blades had a surface that could be rubbed. And it just so happened that I booked an Airbnb that was completely made out of salvage materials that had been salvaged from a tip, or before they went to a tip. It was completely self-sufficient in terms of water and power. And so staying in this place for the night, thinking this whole project is about energy futures. I'm staying in this place that's basically self-sufficient entirely. thought, oh my God, I've got to get an electric car, I've got to charge it, I learned from the sun, I've got to get, and then I went, then I've got to get paper that's environmentally sourced, and then I've got to find foam brushes that are, and I just went, I can't go there. It's just, there is a point at which the work could not get made if I'd taken that to its full extent. And I'm conscious of that, so many artists are, that, you know, essentially we consume a lot of energy and a lot of materials in making our practices. And so I thought I've either got to go there entirely. And funnily enough, most of these works I use these big scale works are made on old maps that I've salvaged from being thrown out from libraries and things in the past. And so usually I would use paper that's recycled essentially. But in this instance, it gets quite brittle over the years, the map paper. And so I was conscious that I didn't want to use that because of the problems with it kind of cracking and going a bit strange. So once I'd kind of gone, well, I'm not going to use recycled maps, I just went, no, back away from that. It's a lovely idea, but you can hear with this, I have a lot of crazy ideas and then have to sort of back away from the cherry pickers.
Yeah, but I mean, the thing that's interesting about that is, you know, because there's a whole debate about the notion of having a, you know, sort of a personal carbon footprint, and you know, whether that's the right way to think about, environmentally friendly energy, etc., and whether it really is a much more of a structural kind of thing that needs to shift, and not necessarily for us to go, okay, I've taken a flight to Sydney, therefore I'm going to buy so many carbon credits.
Yeah.
You know? So I think that this is the thing I find fascinating about art generally, is that it just, all of the decisions that, you know, a practitioner makes during that process resonate with something that is, you know, beyond the bounds of the work, which I think is really what makes it fascinating.
And I think too, one of the conversations that's come up quite a lot because of this exhibition is the relationship that the humanities might have in the conversation around energy futures, and you know, what is it that we can contribute to that, and what is it that art can do for that conversation. And I think, again, getting back to that, you know, the relationship you have to build up with industry partners in this case, where I think, I don't know if Greg could attest to this, but you know, certainly I think for them to have someone do this is actually quite an interesting way of thinking about what it is that they do on a day-to-day basis. And for me, similarly, you know, what is this site? What happens there? What does it do? How does it generate this? And me having those conversations with people. And I just think that is what this exhibition hopefully does, and what the humanities can do for these kind of conversations that you might think are usually situated fixably kind of in the sciences. I think we do have a lot of scope to bring words and conversations to those bigger scientific issues. And it's just how you go about them and how you disseminate, I guess, those conversations is the important thing.
I think what art does, it just it finds a different route into thinking about some of the more, you know, subtle, I suppose, ethical questions and things like this that you're not necessarily thinking about from a scientific or technical.
Yeah. And the human. I mean, always bring it back to the human, I think, is the super important part of this work and of this exhibition too.
Any other questions or just comments or thoughts?
Okay, on that note, we might...
Just in time.
Hi, I'm a first year, thank you, fine arts student, and there's been some beautiful symmetry between what you guys have, what you talked about, and some of the opening lectures we had during Human Orientation Day, with talking about the humanities and what it can offer to society and the world that other domains can't or could contribute to collectively. And this, like that industry relationship, and I think is a beautiful example of that. And I used to do a lot of theatre, and in terms of if you don't ask, you don't get, or having to go out and just have the determination to be like, hey, can we do this thing here? Or can I come borrow this thing? Or can I put the audience on the revolve in the theatre rather than the theatre on the revolve? And kind of crazy questions like that. And once I got that all the way up to the top of Whopper, and then she said no, but anyway, tried. But I just did, building on the earlier comment, there was a moment where I was just struck with how beautifully this correlation and all the little things that went wrong or things that didn't quite initially come out. And there's just this beautiful togetherness of like that atmosphere and those changes and what you tried to capture out on your rubbing, that big physical proximity and how that's actually been brought in to this particular space. And a lot of my first fine art unit was on materiality of and talking about all those relationships and exploring that and experimenting and just trying to discover. And as a student, just to hear this and see this work has been like a really poignant work coming to a very early stage, and I think something really going to take with me in my practice. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. No, I think that's that. You know, for me, like I said before, as somebody who's not an art practitioner, I find that really fascinating. That I did actually do an undergrad degree, and I gave it up because it's almost like I wanted to kind of tell people a story through my artwork, and people would have their own ideas, and it used to really annoy me. So I became a theorist. But I think that is absolutely one of the really fascinating things about contemporary art and contemporary artists. I think there's a certain point at which and for you with this work you were talking about, it was in the hanging of it, and that being a point at which now you feel like you need to let go.
Yeah.
But there's going back to Duchamp and the smashing of the large glass work that he did, and how this was a random element that came into it wasn't planned. I think those parts of our practice are really kind of what make it so interesting. And we were talking about the supply chain issues and things like this. All these incredibly complex things that happen in the world that all have an impact in some way on materially what actually you then see on the wall. And I think that's the really beautiful thing about art. And it's not about statistics and hard science, but it's about the kind of poetics that come with chance and with materials and how they interact with ideas.
And I don't want to go too much longer, but what I just guess I'd add to that is I'm incredibly tough on, I guess, myself and probably students too, in terms of where is it an interesting accident, shift, movement of whatever, and when is it just sloppy? When is it just a mistake that should not have been made and you need to get better? And I think I'm always having that tussle, and so there's things where I just go, no, that's not good enough. That's actually just a bad mistake. Fix it. Or actually, that's really interesting. And isn't that nice the way the wind did that? Or so I think it's always a balance between the two things.
It's kind of editing in that respect.
Yeah,
isn't it? It's been able to
and
recognise
I think that's probably why I'm never content with any work that I make, because I can always go, oh no, that pushed the boundary a bit of whether it was acceptable. I think I'm the world's tough critic on my own work. Because there's things in this I go, oh, really? Just think, anyway.
But I think that's a really important part of our art practice is, being able to, it's kind of having a sort of a capacity to reflectively read your own work, I think.
Yeah, and then also finding the things that were new and interesting and unknown, and then working on those for another piece of work in the future. So I think that's the ultimate kind of interesting part of it for me, is seeing something like this up on a wall and going, wow, that was a physically exhausting piece of work. And had a moment there, I think I emailed Greg about how many wind turbines are there, and is it possible to go to all 52 of them, because I like running, and I was thinking, I'm going to run around every single one because it's about energy, and I'm thinking, no, it's not, you idiot. There's some things where you just got to go nip that idea in the bud. So it's about that constant kind of conversation that you have with yourself about what is an interesting idea and what's just crazy, and then try to somehow make that visual so that other people can in some way partake in those ideas too.
Great. Thank you, everybody. So thanks, Suzanne.
Pleasure.
Thanks for the